You just self-sabotaged again, and the most frustrating part is that you still have no idea why it keeps happening. You walked into that conversation, that meeting or that morning with every intention of doing things differently this time, but then something shifted, and you ended up right back in that familiar spot you swore you'd avoid. Whether it was a blown deadline, a fight you didn't need to pick, or a habit you promised to quit, you're stuck looking at the wreckage of another again. The part that really stings isn't even the failure itself, but the fact that you didn't see the hit coming until it was too late. One minute you were doing fine, and the next, something else seemed to take the wheel, making choices you didn't want and couldn't seem to stop. What's actually happening here is that self-sabotage isn't just one sudden moment of weakness. It is a 5-link chain made of a trigger, an automatic thought, a cognitive distortion, an urge, and finally, the behavior. Which means by the time you get to the part you're mad at yourself for, 4 other things have already gone wrong. Most of these steps happen in under 3 seconds, so the pattern feels invisible not because you aren't paying attention, but because you're staring at link 5, when the only place to kill the momentum is back at link 2. This video is going to walk you through that entire chain from start to finish. We are going to name every link and explain exactly how the mechanism works so you can run it backward on the last time you messed up. By the end of this, you'll have actual proof that this structure fits your life, rather than just another theory that sounds good on paper but fails in practice. Most people who struggle with self-sabotage are looking for the wrong signals in the wrong places. They spend all their energy watching for the behavior, like the skipped gym session or the text message they knew would blow up their relationship, and they stay on high alert, trying to prevent those specific actions. They read every book and make every promise with total sincerity, yet the cycle repeats because they are standing at the very end of the line. When you position yourself at link 5, you've already lost the battle, because the only real window to stop the train is back at link 2. Here is the thing, almost nobody in the self-help world will tell you. Self-sabotage is never a one-off event. It is a 5-link chain that operates the same way every single time, regardless of who you're with or what the specific situation looks like. Even when the triggers and the context change, the underlying machinery stays identical, firing against different inputs to produce that same painful output you're tired of seeing. Carl Jung had a way of explaining this that makes a lot of sense once you strip away the mystery. He argued that the unconscious isn't some scary vault of secrets, but is simply the part of your internal system that you haven't bothered to map out yet. That is a practical way to look at your brain, because once you map the territory, the system stops running on autopilot. The chain has specific parts with specific names, and once you can name them, you can catch them before they finish their work. Most of the advice you find online just gives you a fancy vocabulary to describe your mistakes after they've already happened. What you actually need is a mechanism you can use in real time, which is exactly what this 5-link chain provides. You might feel like you've heard parts of this before, whether it's shadow work or basic therapy concepts, but the vocabulary isn't the problem. What's usually missing is the architecture, the specific sequence of how these links fire, and the knowledge of which link allows you to pull the whole thing apart before the behavior locks in. We are building that map right now, and you'll be able to test it on your own life before the day is over. This framework actually comes from cognitive behavioral therapy, and clinicians call it a behavior chain analysis. Therapists usually use this tool with clients after a relapse or a rough patch to walk backward from a bad decision and find every step that led there. What we are doing here is a bit different, because we are going to learn how to walk that chain forward in real time before you ever reach the behavior you regret. The 5 links you need to know are the trigger, the automatic thought, the cognitive distortion, the urge, and finally, the behavior. It might help to say those out loud to yourself. Trigger, automatic thought, cognitive distortion, urge, behavior. What you are looking at is the literal architecture of every self-sabotage episode you have ever experienced. It was always these 5 things happening in this exact order, and while the circumstances changed every time, the structure underneath them stayed the same. That reframe matters more than it might seem at first glance. If self-sabotage is just a repeating 5-link structure, then it cannot be a character flaw, because character flaws do not have named parts. Patterns have parts, and patterns can be mapped, which means you can eventually locate yourself inside the sequence while it is still in motion. We are going to go through each link in detail and then run through a complete chain so you can watch the whole sequence play out in a single scenario. By the time we get to the end of that walkthrough, you will start recognizing the shape of this in your own life without me even pointing it out. The structure is distinct enough that once you see it clearly, it becomes very difficult to unsee. So let's start at the beginning. A trigger is any event, whether it happens inside your head or out in the world, that starts the chain moving. External triggers are the easy ones to point to. This could be a critical email from your boss, a notification that ruins your plans, or a friend cancelling on you at the last minute. It might be a passing comment from a coworker that lands the wrong way, or a social media post from someone who already has the success you are trying to build. These are time-stamped moments where something happened in the physical world and the chain immediately began. Internal triggers are much harder to catch because they do not announce themselves. This might be a random memory that surfaces while you are making coffee, or a tightening in your chest that arrives before you have even processed what is wrong. It could be that specific brand of dread that settles in on Sunday evenings, which feels less like an event and more like a change in the weather. These are still triggers that start the chain, but they are just a lot quieter about it. The most important thing to understand is that triggers are actually neutral. An email is just text on a screen, a memory is a firing of neurons, and a physical sensation is just data from your body. None of these things actually contain the sabotage themselves. The trigger does not produce the behavior, it just activates link 2, and link 2 is what produces everything else. This is exactly why the way most people describe their own patterns keeps them stuck. You hear people say things like, "I drink when I am stressed," or "I shut down when I feel criticized." But those are link 1 to link 5 descriptions. They skip the 3 links in the middle, which also means they skip the only places where you can actually change the outcome. It is worth remembering that the same trigger produces completely different results for different people. A tough email might floor one person while it barely registers for another, and that difference is not about willpower or personality. The trigger is often outside your control, but the chain that follows it is not, as long as you can see it coming. This is the most important link in the entire sequence because everything that follows depends on it, and it's the only spot where you actually have a chance to stop what's coming. An automatic thought fires in the tiny gap between a trigger and your conscious awareness, and that speed is exactly why it causes so much trouble. By the time you even realize you're thinking something, the thought has already been running for a beat, which makes it feel less like an idea and more like a direct read on the situation. It doesn't arrive wearing a label that says interpretation, but instead, it shows up wearing a label that says fact. The automatic thoughts that cluster around self-sabotage usually follow very recognizable patterns that you've probably heard before. You might hear your brain say things like, "I'm going to fail anyway," or "This is pointless," or maybe, "They don't actually care," and "I don't deserve this." What these phrases share isn't just a negative tone, but rather the grammatical structure of absolute certainty. They are presented to you as observations rather than opinions, and your brain offers them up the same way it shows you the color of a wall. It just feels like what's there. The mechanism that keeps this chain running is the simple fact that the thought doesn't feel automatic, but instead, it feels accurate. If it felt like a distortion or a lie, you would probably push back against it, but it feels like clarity instead. You tell yourself that you're just being realistic, or being honest about how things actually are, but that isn't a sign of weakness. That's the design of the system, where the thought installs itself as a perception before the part of your mind that evaluates reality has a chance to respond. Jung described something very similar to this when he talked about the shadow functioning at its most mundane level. He wasn't talking about repressed rage or hidden trauma in this context, but rather the part of your pattern-making brain that runs below your deliberate examination. The automatic thought is a learned response that was probably accurate somewhere at some point in your life, especially given the conditions where you first developed it. The problem is that the response got wired in so deeply that it now fires indiscriminately against triggers where it doesn't fit anymore. Because you haven't mapped this out yet, you experience the thought as a direct perception of the world rather than a repetitive pattern. The intervention you need is to notice the thought as a thought, which means changing "I'm going to fail anyway" into "I just had the thought that I'm going to fail anyway." That shift in language sounds almost too small to matter, but it creates a vital gap between who you are and what is moving through your mind. You aren't trying to argue with the thought or replace it with something cheerful, but you are finally naming it correctly. That gap is the only place where the chain can break, because without it, the momentum has nowhere to stop. This is where all your leverage lives in the process. You don't want to wait until link 4 when the urge is already pulling you toward a mistake. You have to catch it here, while it's still just a thought that doesn't realize it's a thought. That tiny gap is why tracking this matters. You need somewhere to catch the pattern earlier. This video is sponsored by Senda, the AI journal that shows you the patterns and blind spots shaping your life. Most journals help you get the thought out. Senda helps you go back in, write or speak what happened, get questions from your own words, and over time, surface the patterns that keep repeating across entries. Try it free for 7 days through the link in the description. Now let's look at the distortion that makes the thought feel impossible to question. The automatic thought never arrives alone, because it always brings reinforcements to back it up. Cognitive distortions are the logic structures that wrap around that initial thought to make it feel bulletproof. They aren't just random errors in your thinking, but are recruited specifically to confirm whatever the automatic thought already decided was true. By the time a distortion finishes running its course, the thought isn't just a feeling anymore, but has become a full legal case with evidence assembled and a verdict reached. There are roughly a dozen named distortions in clinical psychology, but 4 of them show up most reliably in self-sabotage chains. All or nothing thinking is the first one, and it draws a hard line where shades of grey actually exist. If the conditions aren't right for a perfect attempt, the distortion tells you there is no point in trying at all. The project sits untouched, not because you are lazy, but because of a rule the distortion invented, stating that anything partial counts as nothing. The middle ground, where most real progress happens, simply disappears from your view. Mind reading is another common trap, where you assign a specific negative judgment to someone else and then treat that invented judgment as hard data. You haven't actually spoken to them, and you don't know what they think, but the distortion doesn't require evidence to function. It generates its own proof, and then forces you to act on that generated evidence as though it came from the outside world. Catastrophizing is even more aggressive because it compresses a long chain of cause and effect into one single inevitable disaster. One missed step doesn't just produce one small consequence, but instead it produces the absolute worst plausible endpoint you can imagine. The logic looks like a careful analysis, but it's actually just amplification, wearing the costume of foresight. Each step feels reasonable to you in the moment, precisely because the distortion is very careful about how it moves from one fear to the next. Finally, emotional reasoning runs in one direction only, where your internal feeling becomes the ultimate proof of reality. You might tell yourself that you feel like a fraud, which must mean you are one, or that a situation feels hopeless, so it is. The feeling itself is very real, and that's what makes the conclusion feel so grounded and believable. However, the inference is backwards, because your internal state is not evidence about the external situation, but only a reflection of your current mood. What all 4 of these distortions do is exactly the same thing. They take the automatic thought and make it feel irrefutable. The thought said something negative, and the distortion steps in to explain exactly why that thought is correct. One exit closes, then another, and then another, until you are trapped. What started as a fast and unlabeled interpretation has now become a sealed room. Still are in this sequence of events. The bad behavior hasn't happened yet, and nothing has been blown, broken, or sent to anyone. You are still just thinking, but the chain is pulling hard now, and the next link is where you start to feel that pull in your actual body. The urge is basically what happens when your nervous system tries to catch up to a conclusion your mind already reached. By the time you hit link 4, that automatic thought has already installed itself as the absolute truth, and the distortion has built an airtight case around it. Now the whole system feels like it needs to move. That pressure you feel, that heavy pull toward a specific action, is the urge. It is a physical impulse rather than a conscious decision, and it points toward one thing: relief. This isn't about finding happiness or long-term success. It is simply about removing whatever painful feeling the chain has produced so far. That distinction matters because it changes how you read the behavior that follows. The urge isn't actually trying to destroy things, it is just trying to find equilibrium again. When the chain generates anxiety, shame, or that specific flavor of hopelessness, the urge points toward whatever has historically made those feelings stop, even if it only works for a minute. Your nervous system isn't running your 5-year plan at link 4. It is running a much older program designed to find the fastest available route back to feeling okay. This is why avoidance, conflict, and numbing all serve the same function, even though they look completely different on the outside. Avoidance keeps you safe from data that might confirm the negative thought, while conflict externalizes the internal pressure and turns it into something happening out there. Numbing just reduces the signal strength of everything. These are different behaviors doing the same job, which is to get the system back below the threshold where the discomfort was sitting. Most people experience link 4 as a total loss of control. A more accurate way to see it is that control was never really on the table here without an earlier intervention. The trigger has fired, the thought has run, the distortion has closed off the alternatives, and now there is a felt urgency moving toward a specific action. That isn't a sign of weakness, it is just what link 4 looks like structurally, every single time. This is exactly why you can't wait until this point to try to change what happens next. The only place the chain was still open was back at link 2, and the urge is just what you feel when that window has already passed. The behavior is the chain finally finishing what it started. It shows up as the skipped deadline, the resignation letter, the blown conversation, or the relapse. Looking back on it afterward, it feels like a decision, and usually a bad one that confirms something you already feared about yourself. It feels like the exact moment you failed. But 5 distinct events had already occurred before the behavior happened, and most of them moved faster than your conscious attention could track. The trigger activated the thought called up its distortion, the distortion pressured the system into the urge, and the urge selected the behavior that promised the fastest return to equilibrium. By the time you actually did the thing, you weren't really choosing in the way we usually mean that word. You were just completing a sequence. This is what sits underneath the phrase, "I don't know why I keep doing this." It isn't that there is no reason. There is a very specific reason with named parts in a fixed order. The reason just lives in links 2 and 3, which run in the time it takes to read a subject line or hear a particular tone in someone's voice. The behavior isn't the mystery. It is the receipt for a transaction that happened earlier. When you blame yourself at link 5, you are applying accountability to the wrong address. The behavior is where the chain became visible, but visibility and causation aren't the same thing. You can see the smoke and still be looking in the wrong room for the fire. Understanding this doesn't dissolve responsibility, but it does relocate it accurately. The question stops being, "Why did I do that again?" and becomes, "Where in the sequence could I have seen this coming?" Those are different questions, and only the second one has a useful answer. Let's walk through what this looks like for one person, so the whole sequence stops feeling like an abstract theory. Maya works as a freelance designer, and she has a big client presentation coming up this Friday. It is currently Wednesday evening, and the work is actually in great shape because she has put a lot of deep thought into the project, and the slides are looking solid. There is no logical reason for her to feel any sense of alarm. She opens her laptop to check her inbox and sees a new message from the client with a subject line that just says, "Quick question before Friday." That right there is the trigger. It is time-stamped, external, and technically neutral, yet it is just a simple string of words sitting in a subject field. The automatic thought fires before she even clicks the mouse, because she has already decided they are unhappy with her direction. She has zero evidence for this, and the email is still unopened, but the thought does not arrive as a guess, it arrives as a fact. She feels like she isn't guessing, but rather seeing the truth, which is exactly how this mechanism is designed to work. The distortions start running almost immediately behind that first thought. Mind reading kicks in as she assigns a specific judgment to the client that she cannot possibly know for sure. Catastrophizing follows that thread even further, and she starts telling herself that if they are unhappy, she will have to redo everything before Friday. Since that feels impossible, she decides she will miss the deadline, lose the client forever, and watch her professional reputation take a hit she might never recover from. In less than 10 seconds, a 5-word subject line has transformed into a total narrative of professional collapse. The urge hits her now, and it points toward one specific action, which is to not open that email. She wants to stay in the space where the outcome is still technically unknown, because avoidance feels like a temporary relief. To get that comfort, she doesn't open it, and instead switches tabs to look at something else. An hour disappears into nothing, and by then it is late enough to justify leaving the whole mess for the morning. When she wakes up on Thursday, the email is still sitting there, but now it feels heavier because it is carrying every fear she projected onto it overnight. The anxiety has compounded while she slept. She spends the day opening smaller messages and working around her inbox to avoid the one thing that scares her. Thursday passes by, Friday morning arrives, and the window for the presentation finally closes. From the outside, it looks like she just procrastinated and missed a deadline, and Maya will probably tell herself that she let everyone down again. What actually happened was a 5-link chain that moved from a subject line to a missed presentation in under 3 seconds, then spent 48 hours playing itself out. When she finally opens the email 2 days late, the client's question was just asking if she wanted to use Zoom or Google Meet for the call. The chain does not need a real threat to ruin your week. It only needs a trigger that looks like a threat. And once that first thought fires, the rest of the structure takes over. And understanding this matters because it goes much deeper than just having a few bad habits. The triggers in your life change constantly, whether it is a mean comment, a work email, or a random memory that hits you at 2 in the morning. Even though these inputs are different, the automatic thoughts and the distortions that follow them stay remarkably consistent. They are yours. They are the unique signature of your specific chain. This is why so many people feel like they keep ending up in the same bad situations, even when their circumstances change. The situations are actually different, but the chain running underneath them is exactly the same. You are not unlucky or cursed, but you are running the same internal program against a rotating set of triggers and getting the same result every time. In a clinical setting, the thing that anchors this whole chain is called a schema. This is a deep, rigid belief about yourself or the world that acts like source code for your brain. The schema picks the thought finds a distortion to back it up, and that distortion creates the urge that leads to your behavior. Usually, that behavior ends up confirming the original belief. You tell yourself you are going to fail, and then you do, because the chain created the exact conditions needed to make that come true. That is a loop with its own internal logic, and it is not a flaw in your character. You are going to work with this framework in 2 different directions to make it stick. First, I want you to look backward. Pick the most recent time you sabotaged yourself, but don't go for your worst, life-altering mistake. Just choose the most recent one you can remember clearly. You are going to map that specific moment onto these 5 links. Start at the very end with link 5. Write down the behavior in one plain sentence that stays neutral and specific. Don't write, "I failed," because that is a judgment rather than a description of what happened. Try something like, I didn't send the application, or I started the argument, or I opened the bottle on a night I had already decided I wouldn't drink. Once that is done, jump all the way back to link 1 to find the trigger. This shouldn't be a general mood or a vague state of mind, but a specific event you can locate in time. General stress isn't a trigger, but the specific email that landed in your inbox while you were already feeling stressed is definitely a trigger. Now you have to find the automatic thought, which is usually the hardest part to do after the fact. These thoughts move so fast and feel so true that you probably logged it as a reality rather than just a thought. Look for the exact second the situation stopped feeling open, and ask yourself what you quietly decided was true about yourself or the person standing in front of you. Then, you need to name the distortion, whether that is all or nothing thinking, mind reading, or catastrophizing. More than one of these can run at the same time, so do not worry about getting the label perfect, because being close enough is plenty. Finally, name the urge and identify what kind of relief that behavior was actually chasing. Were you looking for avoidance, a bit of conflict, or maybe just a way to numb out and collapse? When you map those 5 links onto a real event, you aren't just getting an insight, you are actually collecting data. You are seeing the shape of your specific chain drawn from your own history, and that shape is exactly what you will be watching for as you move forward. This leads us to the second direction, which is looking ahead. You aren't trying to catch every trigger, since most of them are out of your control anyway. You also aren't trying to muscle through the urge at link 4, because by that point, the chain has way too much momentum. Instead, you are watching for link 2, which is the moment a thought arrives pretending to be a fact. You might hear, "This is pointless," or "They have already decided." But when you catch it, you don't argue. You just name it accurately by saying, "I just had the thought that this is pointless." And that single move is the entire intervention. This is not a reframe in the way motivational speakers use the word. You are not trying to force yourself to feel differently or conjure up some optimism that you don't actually have right now. What you are doing is learning how to observe a fast-moving process so you can name one of its parts before the whole sequence finishes. That is a completely different project that does not require traditional willpower or a specific set of beliefs. It just requires a very specific kind of attention that can catch something moving at the speed of a thought and simply say, "There it is." Most of this 5-part chain actually happens before you even take a visible step, which is why focusing on your actions usually fails. You have likely spent years beating yourself up at the very end of the process, but the real opportunity to change was always sitting back at step 2. If you never managed to catch it there, it is simply because nobody pointed out where to look. But now you finally have that map.